There's so much more in this text. I think it'll change the way you even experience the Christmas story. So, buckle up. We've got some studying to do. First, you need to know that the purpose of Matthew's genealogy is to mark Jesus squarely in the lineage. I mean, firmly in the Israelite tradition. Our soon-to-be-born King of Kings. He's not an alien. He's not brought in to disrupt or pivot or confuse the human narrative. Jesus is the culmination. The people who came before him matter, and he is their rightful heir. He is the king, and he's coming through the Israelite nation. His ancestors are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Boaz and Jesse, King David, King Solomon, the patriarchs of a grand tradition, the greatest of the pillars of our faith, which stands to reason that this baby-born king will also become a pillar of the faith like the people before him. And Matthew knows what he's doing. He is opening his gospel by setting the stage for who this baby king is. Jesus comes with a tradition in tow. He's its fulfillment and its hope for the future of God's chosen people. So, when we read it, it sounds boring, but it's anything but. Second, before we jump into this, there's something you just need to know about genealogies. It's important for you to hold that this is not the only genealogy in Scripture. The Old Testament is full of them. The family unit mattered so much to ancient Hebraic circles that when you were named as the son of your father, who was named as the son of his father, and so on. So the use of a genealogy here in Matthew 1 isn't what makes this important. It's not just a standalone moment. It's the names that get brought in. And that's what I want us to drill down into. Because when we do, something emerges that's just not quite right. We get the names of 5 women. That's interesting. I mean, genealogies, 99% of the time in the Old Testament, were named through the father's family only. Women, sadly, were subjugated to a lesser role in biblical history. I mean, rarely, and I mean rarely, do women ever get named or for the narrative to revolve around their character. Now, why this is a Bible study for another day. But just knowing this detail, it matters because in the list of 42 generations in Matthew 1, 5 are women. 5. That's a lot. I mean, no, it's not a lot. But considering the context, the circumstances, and the culture, 5, when there should be 0, seems like a lot. I mean, it's so blatantly obvious. The listeners and readers of Matthew, they would have noticed. They would have perked up immediately. They would have thought, wonder what all these names are doing in here. It seems to be pretty consistent. He's bringing in these women's names. And what significance do they hold when you prop up these women's names against Abraham, Isaac, and even King David? Let's find out. We need to get to know who these 5 women are. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, who's not technically named, but we know her as Bathsheba, and then Mother Mary. So let's start with Tamar. She is introduced in Genesis 38. This is not a story that you would want to read to your kids at night. But everyone should be at least familiar with how it goes, because it's really awful. I'll just briefly say, Tamar was chosen to be the wife of Judah's oldest son, who was to bear a son. Well, didn't live, so Judah told his next oldest son, Onan, to marry Tamar, but he died too. There was a third son, Shelah, who would fill the role of husband, but he wasn't old enough yet. So Tamar was forced to live with her in-laws until the youngest son became of age. Long story short, Tamar gets pregnant with twins. The father is her father-in-law. Yeah, Judah. And it gets worse. He gets so embarrassed by this, he tries to kill Tamar, but she outsmarts him and ends up living and raising her twin boys alone. Genesis 38 is a story of incest, and it didn't have to be mentioned in the genealogy. We could have conveniently skipped right over it. So why is it in there? Hold that thought. The second woman is Rahab. She's a prostitute. You can read about her story in Joshua chapter 2. It's an amazing story. As the story goes, Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho. The spies come to the city, they meet a prostitute, and they stay the night with her. The king of Jericho learns that these spies are in the town, so he sends troops to kill them. Rahab learns that there are people coming to kill the spies, so she hides them in her attic. After the king's men leave and she lies to them, saying she's never seen them, Rahab lets them climb out of her window using a rope and gives them a safe passage to take to leave the city. You may have heard the story, or at least the phrase, Rahab's rope. Joshua 2 is the story of how God uses a woman who was caught in a lifestyle she didn't want to further God's story. She didn't have to be included in Jesus' genealogy either. So why is she brought into the text? Hold that thought. The third woman is Ruth. It's the same Ruth as the story of the book of the Bible. This might feel like, oh good, this will be less scandalous. Nope. There's a widowed woman named Naomi who had 2 sons who married Moabite women. One of them was Ruth. Both sons died. Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws that they can go back to their homeland and to live with their parents. Now one did, but Ruth stayed. She wanted to live with Naomi. And this is where we get the famous line from Ruth 1:16. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Anyway, Naomi introduces Ruth to a distant relative named Boaz. Ruth wanted to be with Boaz, so she seduces him one night while he's inebriated. That's in your Bible. He wakes up. He's very confused. He then tries to find another family member to take Ruth as his wife. No one wants to marry her, so he ends up marrying her himself. So now, in the pages of Jesus' genealogy, the most important genealogy in history, we now have a story of incest, prostitution, and seduction. And it's all playing out in the stories of Jesus' genealogy. I told you it wasn't boring. Is it appropriate to talk about on Sunday morning? You be the judge. But it's definitely not boring. So, why are they mentioned? Hold that thought. The fourth woman isn't named per se, but we know her as Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Uriah was the army general, the right-hand man to King David, and arguably one of his best friends. One day, David sees Uriah's wife taking a bath on a roof. And then we learn that King David commits adultery, then feels bad about it. Instead of owning up to it, he demands Uriah go to the front of the line in battle to make sure his best friend's killed, making it possible for David to marry his best friend's now widow. King David sentences his friend to death so he could marry his friend's wife after committing adultery so no one would find out. And this is the mother of Solomon. So now, You've got a story of incest, prostitution, seduction, adultery, radiating from the pages of Jesus' genealogy. Why? Why include these narratives if we could have just skipped right over them? There's a lot of speculation as to why. And you should think deeply about what you think that answer is. But I'll tell you mine. What if, even right here, at the beginning of the pages of Jesus' good news, the story of his life and salvation for humanity, the beginning of the gospel, what if the Spirit of God is showing us that Jesus isn't going to be a king like all the other kings? You know, the King David kind of kings, the army man, the take no prisoners kind of king, the get whatever I want whenever I want it kind of king. Now sure, Jesus is the culmination of these pillars of faith, but what if he's here to expand the definition of king? I mean, that's what he does. The kingdom he brings isn't what we think. He brings a heavenly kingdom that's full of love and inclusion, not hate or division. And he represents not just the orderly and the chosen, the cookie cutter or the privileged kinds of people. He represents even those that history would rather push to the margins. Blessed are the outcast. Blessed are the disenfranchised. Blessed are the lowly and the poor and the meek and the mourning. Jesus always, and I mean always, stands with the people on the margins, always, even those whom history would rather us forget. He never represents the powerful and the privileged alone. He ushers in space for the powerless and the underprivileged to be known and graced too, every time. And now, whether it's subconscious for Matthew as he's writing the gospel narrative or not, I think we're getting a glimpse of this deep, and I mean deep truth, however subtle it may be, right here in the genealogy. Jesus is not just going to be for the Abrahams, the Isaacs, and the Jacobs. He is also going to be for the Ruths and Rahabs and Tamars of this world and everyone in between. And the beginning of his story, the genealogy, the prelude before we even get his birth, it includes all of God's people. The Abrahams, Isaacs, and Jacobs, and the Ruths, Rahabs, and Tamars. To me, this is amazing. This is unbelievably good news. Because the way that we try to declassify and diminish the humanity of others, Jesus never does. His kingship is a kinship, inviting all people, no matter what, into the fold and family of God. And to prove it, some of the most scandalous stories of the Old Testament, they get propped up right in the midst of Jesus' genealogy, right from the beginning. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And it just goes to show us all that when it comes to salvation, Jesus is the Messiah for all people, which includes you, by the way, and me. All of our baggage, all of our wickedness, all of our failures, all of our dread, all of our shame. We are never outside the realm of God's mercy. Jesus becomes the Messiah, even for all of us. And as Matthew 1:1 says it, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. He's ushering in a new kingdom. And this new kingdom starts on the margins. It brings those who would normally be forgotten, those who would be relegated to the shadows of history, and brings those people into the light. And he positions them next to the people we've propped up and called the pillars of our faith. For in Jesus' genealogy, we see this little light shining from one person to another. Jesus' genealogy is one that reminds us all that we all belong. We all matter. No matter how scandalous or broken or pitiful or wasteful or tumultuous our lives are or have become, we still belong. We're still included. God's peace, it shines to us all. Jesus' kingship is a kinship. And we see this clearly with the fifth woman mentioned in Jesus' genealogy, Mother Mary. She is an absolute nobody. When we read her story, especially in Luke 2, we see that she becomes positioned next to the greatest pillars of all of our faith. Now, I could be wrong, but I think this is why these 5 women are included. I think it's for us to see that Jesus' kingship is a kinship, which includes us all, which means there is room for every one of us. So this Advent, our theme has been this little light of mine. The light that shines throughout the generations is now shining on us. And we aren't too broken, too cruel for God to shine that light of peace on us this Christmas. And you have a chance to shine that light for others to see as well. You are an incredibly important part in Jesus' lineage. His genealogy continues, and it includes you. You too are a part of the family of God.